Good morning, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good day to everybody. My name is Jeff Pettifer. I'm co-chair of the Near Surface Geophysics Committee on UAB Geophysics Guidelines, and I'll be convening this webinar with my co-chair Ron Bell, who I'll introduce shortly. I put here a notice about where the URL, and in the chat we put the notice of where the URL is. We apologise because the last minute glitches with the website, it may not be downloadable just yet, so we'll keep you updated on that. So welcome to this global event, and we hope that there's a great interest to you. We particularly want to thank the SEG for hosting and publicising this webinar. And of course, all of us are residents on lands which are occupied by traditional peoples and wherever we're located in the world. And we take this opportunity to thank these original ongoing caretakers of these lands and the associated waters, and we thank them for their stewardship. In my case, I'm broadcasting from Perth, so I acknowledge the local custodians of country, particularly the Whadjuk people, and I recognise their continuing connection to land, sea, culture and community. And so we pay respect to elders past, present and emerging of traditional owner countries, the communities, wherever these communities and the audience members call home. So this is just an overview of the event. It's going to be a total of 3 hours, so thank you to all of you wherever you're located for logging in. We're going to have some breaks. There'll be 1 hour before the first break, where we'll have the welcome and introduction, talk about philosophy and look at how we configure and configure drones and acquire magnetic surveys. We'll then take a break, and there'll be 2 presentations on what we do with the data and how we ensure that the data is good quality in terms of compensating it and processing it, and also what we do with it in terms of imaging and interpretation. Another break, and then a Q&A panel of presenters, which Ron will convene, and the closing remarks. So I'm going to be talking about just basically welcome everybody, introduce the committee and speakers, and talk briefly about the website. We're not going to be talking about the magnetics basics. That's a whole webinar in itself, and we'll refer you to the document when it's available to read that. And there's also extensive references and bibliography. Ron will then take over and finish the introduction and talk about the philosophy and scope of the guidelines. And he'll also be one of the main speakers and introduce the other 3 speakers. The first thing that Ron will be talking about will be about these chapters 3 to 6. In particular, later in the event, he'll chair the panel. The next speaker will be Paul Mutton, and Paul will talk about how to acquire good data and particularly look at survey planning, magnetic survey noise sources, and acquisition and QC, QA. Raina will be talking about particularly how the principles of good processing from the airborne industry can be applied to drone data, and also how we can compensate the measurements for the effect of the drone platform. And finally, Tim Archer will talk about what we can do with our data in terms of optimising the imaging and interpretation of it. The webinar will then be joined, the panel will then consist of 3 other people that are on the call. Johannes Stoll is an expert in vector magnetics, Leslie McChesney, who wrote the safety and regulation section, and Callum Walter, who is an expert on the effect of the drone platform on our measurements. So here's our committee. I won't go through them in detail, but just be rest assured that we've got a lot of industry leaders here that are very interested in making sure that we have good guidelines, just not for magnetics, but also for every sensor which is flown from a drone. And the committee is represented from a number of companies and a number of societies. So it truly is an inter-society effort. And we have subcommittees. On the left is the magnetic subcommittee, and I've highlighted in yellow people that have actually contributed words and ideas to the document in some great degree. All the others in the committee have also contributed in discussions and ideas as well. We have the radiometrics committee with Stephen van der Beek, who presented at the recent summit on the progress of our guidelines. Stephen has a reasonable draft of the radiometrics well and truly underway. The electromagnetics committee, subcommittee, 4 people, which is just about to start getting very active. And we have a GPR committee, which at the moment is Jan Frank. And I'm sure Jan would welcome anybody else to join the committee. In fact, anybody on this call, if you feel that you'd want to get involved in this ongoing initiative, we need your expertise to join any one of these subcommittees. We're also thinking about extending this to gravity and other remote sensing such as spectral and hyperspectral. So if you've got an interest or expertise, please get in touch with the committee. Now, members of a committee belong to a whole bunch of societies, and we've just put their logos here. The geophysical societies at the top. We've got geological societies from groundwater, petroleum, and geotechnical. We have the airborne safety societies. We have the Australian Institute of Geoscientists and peak bodies, women in aviation, and professional associations. And the members are also, of course, work for a living, and we thank them and their companies for providing their IP. They could have kept that as a competitive advantage, but they've chosen to share it with the community. And we thank all of these people and their companies for their community spirit in developing these guidelines. The document itself, in the document, when you see it, you'll see a table 1, which gives all the contributors of the various sections of the report. And if I was to sum up the document in one word, it would be best practice. And best practice is a standard or set of guidelines that is known to produce good outcomes if followed. And even though it's not a legal requirement to follow best practice guidelines, it is a practice that usually presents the optimal way to work. So very quickly, it's a big document. I won't go through it in detail, but you can see here there's 14 sections covering from introduction through setup, acquisition, processing, imaging and interpretation, some conclusions, recommendation, and an extensive biography. There's 15 tables and 44 figures to illustrate what we're on about. So most importantly, part of the guidelines are you, and when you get to download them, and we apologise again if you can't download them at the moment. We tried our best, but something went wrong at the end there and we couldn't get it properly configured. However, when you download the guidelines, there'll be a Word document with track changes, and we encourage you to make changes or suggestions, edits, comments. Save that as a new document name, perhaps put your initials in front of the document name, and then there will be a facility to upload to the website. So thank you again. Thank you to SEG. Thank you to the committee. Thank you all for attending, and I'll hand over now to Ron.
All right. My name is Ron Bell. I'm a geophysicist and a geodronologist. That's a term I coined because I use drones to map geology. And I'm located in the Denver area. What I'm going to talk about today is I decided as I was putting this together, we needed to at least touch on a little bit about why drone geophysics. And then if we're going to talk about why drone geophysics, we've got to at least put it in the context of what is drone geophysics. And then I'm going to talk about the guideline document, where to download it when it's available. I'm going to kind of touch on the philosophy of the guidelines, why we actually have made the effort to create one. And then I'm going to actually move on to magnetic survey type, drone systems configurations, a little bit about survey safety and positioning and mapping. I'm not going to focus on a lot of that. That's a lot of that information will be in the guidelines. Really, it's just an intro to it at this point. And then following that, Paul is going to pick up magnetic survey design, and Rainer's going to talk about compensation, and then Kim is going to talk about imaging and interpretation. And that's really what we're trying to convey, is at least give you an intro of what we're trying to do here. And then at the end, we'll have as Jeff said, we're going to have a panel discussion and invite a few other people who are experts in specific areas to join us on the panel. And then we'll go through some of the burning questions you will probably have by that time. So why geophysics? Well, why drone geophysics? Probably the most significant reason why people are employing drone geophysics is that we can actually access difficult areas in ways that we were prevented one way or another, either by the actual area itself, topography, the risks associated with it, or just the costs of doing so. Then the fundamental reason why drone geophysics, underlying all of this, is we're automating the data collection process. And that has great ramification in terms of the utilization of geophysical data, the collection of geophysical data in the long term. And we're in the early days of a lot of data collection automation. And then that leads to why do we want to do that? And the why we want to do that is we're really working to reduce the cost per data point. That actually then benefits us by allowing us to collect a lot more data for the same budget. Not necessarily geophysical data. As you'll see, there's other data types we might want to collect as well. And then we would diminish the amount of the impact of human error in our data volumes. We would increase our spatial data density and the volume of data. That actually plays a very important role in applying AI and machine learning to the data to extract information from it. And then we're going to reduce the risk of property and personnel. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is achieve our goals sooner in the process. Whatever your process or application is, the whole idea of using drones to collect the geophysical data is ultimately we're trying to get to the endpoint much quicker. Geophysical data fits within the context of a broader frame of data that we are we are calling geoscience data. The top of this slide, you'll see I have outlined the types of data that are now acquired for geoscientific mapping that we tend to refer to as remote sensing. Obviously, there's a correlation to satellite data as well. In fact, a lot of our data is really very integratable, if you will, with satellite data. So the very top there is the types of remote sensing data that is commonly acquired for a variety of geoscientific mapping applications. Starting with, and all of that is above, most of that is above the surface of the Earth. That black line across the center there, that's represents where the surface is. We do have some geophysical data in the form of gamma ray spectrometry, which we're mapping the response, the emission from the surface of the Earth, but most all of geophysics is really dealing with things that are happening within the subsurface. What we're trying to map or detect or things that are happening within the subsurface of the Earth beyond our visual line of sight. That's a small joke. The one that we're talking about today is really about magnetics. That's probably the most universally applied. Eventually, we'll get into dealing with electromagnetics and ground penetrating radar. We'll deal with gamma ray spectrometry. And then at the bottom there, I have seismic and gravity. And drones actually are used to support seismic surveys and gravity surveys right now. And there is, I understand, some research going on about being able to collect those data types from drones. but for now, they're not actually commercially or widely available. So we're not going to focus on that. And in fact, as the committee came together, we actually decided that we didn't really need to focus on the remote sensing stuff right away, but there was a real need to be able to focus on putting together guidelines for the geophysical data because in fact there wasn't much out there. So you can do a Google search and you can find things about the remote sensing on the internet. So with respect to the guidelines, this is the overall mission of creating the guidelines. Is we're going to try to address the methodologies that can be applied on or acquired where you put the sensor on a small unmanned aircraft system, and that right now is defined as being 55 pounds or 25 kg maximum takeoff weight. In the future, what my view is that we're likely to see bigger aircraft, but for now, that's our legal restriction to be able without getting a specialized waiver. At the very top, we're talking about magnetics today. In the near term, we're going to be working on EM. That's actually a lot of my focus and my work is EM. Ground penetrating radar. We have some experts in that, radiometrics. They're all putting together parts of this document eventually, and then hopefully within the next year, we'll actually have that out and ready as a guideline for acquiring that data as well. And as far as seismic and gravity, there are question marks now. They're certainly on the mind of most people that are doing geophysics, and it's just a matter of time, I think, we'll have a guideline for those. So this is just a repeat of what was Jeff put up. That is the website for going on. Most all of you have actually gone and registered, or a lot of you have. I'm getting all of these registration emails. I'm happy to see that. Moving right into the philosophy of the guidelines, I tried to write something that was relatively succinct. Basically, this is a grassroots initiative where we're trying to convey the best practices for geophysical data collection. And in this case today, we're going to talk about magnetics, but it's geophysical data collection via autonomously operated, unoccupied aerial vehicles, or basically drones. The goal is to obtain the best possible data for the intended purpose. I kind of coined the phrase, we're going to educate the practitioners. Some of you may actually be acquiring mag data and may be very knowledgeable about it, but we're trying to give a broader sense of education for those that are knowledgeable. And for those that are getting into it and are thinking about becoming doing drone mag surveys, we're trying to educate you on what the geophysical community believes are the best practices. And then the other aspect of this whole initiative is to inform the customers of drone geophysical data about what are the best practices. And the idea there is that at least they can make a judgment on whether or not whoever's giving them their data, if it conforms or was acquired according to what the industry considers to be the best practices for drone geophysics. So I'm going to talk a little bit, start off by talking about the drone geophysics measurement space. In my work, I've determined there are actually 3 different altitudes that we operate at that depending on what the application is, you would either operate at standard altitude. That's typically where a lot of drone pilots like to fly. There's very little opportunity to run into vertical structures, and standard altitude, you're above the treetops, basically. Then there's what I call low altitude, and that is from the treetops to about 5 meters AGL. And that's an area that you have to be much more diligent about and more diligent on how you actually perform the surveys. You don't want to hit trees or vertical structures. Nobody wants to do that. So there's a lot more effort into actually designing and conducting the data collection. And then there's ultra low altitude, and that there is where we're trying to bring the sensor very close to the ground surface. And for some applications, that's essential. We wouldn't have any signal otherwise. Standard altitude tends to be for geologic mapping. A low altitude, you would also apply to geologic mapping, but you would be also looking at other applications. And ultra low altitude, it's really typically about finding things that are buried in the near surface. So what are the magnetic survey data types? Well, geologic mapping is the first and foremost and most widely used reason for widely used. Magnetics is most widely used for geologic mapping for resource exploration all over the globe, searching for new sources of commodities. Often it's minerals, but it can be other types of resources, oil and gas, groundwater, geothermal. It's a basic geologic mapping tool. And that is, in fact, one of the reasons that this is coming about is because in geologic mapping, we need to have as low noise and highest quality data as that can possibly be acquired, because we're really looking at very subtle responses at times, and we need to be able to see those. Infrastructure detection and delineation. It's hard to say if that's the second most widely used application of magnetics. But there's a lot of oil and gas wells that are being found with magnetics. I do that. There's a fair number of pipelines, other things that human activity has left behind in the ground. We can use a magnetic survey for environmental subsurface characterization. That kind of falls into the category of unexploded ordnance, which I've separated. At least in North America, magnetics is not as widely used for unexploded ordnance. The tendency these days is used electromagnetics. But in other areas of the globe, magnetics has a real role to play to identify areas where there's possibly things that are left behind from wars or whatever. It could be bombs, it could be mines, things like that. Magnetics is often used for archaeology too. And again, unexploded ordnance and archaeology, those are areas where we're actually going to want to fly the sensor very close to the ground surface in the domain of ultra low altitude. And then there's the other, and I put in there treasure hunting, anything that's ferromagnetic, steel or iron in the subsurface becomes a target or a potential target for using a magnetic survey. So I'm sure there may be other types, but those are the ones that I could come up with. So as far as drone configurations, there's basically four, one might call 2 or 3 orientations, configurations. Right now, most drone mag is done with a multi-copter, which has multiple rotors. I use a hexacopter, some use a quadcopter. Helicopters have gotten kind of out of favor, although I understand they are still utilized. I just don't see them in a lot of from any of my competitors. We're using multi-copters. And then there are fixed wing versions of UAVs, and now in this day and age, we're really moving more to a vertical takeoff and landing fixed wing. Those are becoming more prevalent. Now the magnetometer is either mounted on the aircraft, and in the case of a multi-copter, it's mounted directly on the aircraft, or it's suspended below the aircraft. There's reasons for that, and you will learn why those reasons are why it's deployed like that from the other presenters. And then with a fixed wing or a VTOL fixed wing, we're actually integrating the magnetic sensor into the aircraft. That requires a little bit more effort, and whereas if you're just using a multi-copter, you can use magnetometers that have no connection to the aircraft and no dependence on the other aircraft, other than the fact that you're using it as a vehicle to move the sensor across above the ground. As survey safety, I quickly put this together. There are some documents that we reference, a lot of safety procedures provided by other aspects of the UAV industry and the airborne industry. The one that I've kind of been concentrating on most recently is pilot training. getting a certification process for flying MAG surveys or EM surveys. And I've been talking to the aviation guys, and they think of this more as a rating versus a certification. Whatever it is, pilot training is an important part of having survey safety. UAV maintenance is also an important part of it. These are aircraft that are being, they have a tendency to fall out of the earth. If they crash, you really want to make sure that before you put it up again, that it's actually in good flying order. Pre-flight system checks, that is an extremely important thing for all pilots to do. You want to make sure that before that aircraft lifts off the ground, that it actually as anything that you can see visually or anything that you could do as another system check, you really want to do and before each flight. Flight operations protocols and procedures. I don't really want to go into a lot of that, but we do with my staff, we do have a set of protocols we go through religiously whenever we're out collecting data. And then I think that probably the most important thing to consider in terms of safety is common sense. Is that if it looks like it's a dangerous situation, it probably is a dangerous situation. And you need to take precautions, you need to take actions that prevent accidents and prevent injury to people, prevent injury to things on the ground, and particularly your drone. Just a little bit of common sense can go a long way. So positioning and mapping, when I was given this, I thought, well, there's probably plenty in there that kind of goes through the basics, but you have actually two options in terms of positioning, and that is either standard or RTK GNSS. And for a lot of geologic mapping, a standard or a high grade GNSS is system on the drone is probably adequate for the geologic mapping that I've done. The system that I fly, the MAG system, actually has a GNSS system integrated into it, and it's a standard one, and it's adequate for geologic mapping when I'm flying at standard altitudes. It's inadequate when I'm flying very close to the surface and very tight line spacing, and so I've actually complemented that system with an RTK GNSS, where I'm actually collecting centimeter level positioning on centimeter scale positioning on the drone, which I then transfer to the magnetometer and replace what the magnetometer data has as is position. So you have a choice of actually using the navigation system on the drone, or you can actually integrate it with the magnetometer, and RTK becomes very necessary when you're flying ultra altitude, low altitude, very tight line spacing surveys. But otherwise, I don't think it's all that necessary. So I wanted to throw this in here to kind of make the pitch to you all, to contribute to, these are the folks that are on the committee at this point. We really want this to be an industry, global industry-wide initiative. So if you feel that, we encourage you to download when it's available, the document, or I will send it, make it available and send you the Dropbox address. And then we encourage you to review it and to edit and to contribute to making this a real positive contribution to our industry. And you can join the committee. You can do so today. I'm sure that Jeff has a few words to say about this. Do you, Jeff?
Sorry, I thought you were inviting me to speak. There's been a few questions in the chat, which I've endeavoured to answer. So hopefully everybody can see those answers. I don't really see that. I should give a big shout out to Ron Bell, because Ron has, at his own volition, has put some seed money in to get our website off the ground. But if you could talk, if you people on the call, if you could, you think this is a good initiative. We were looking for sponsors for the website just to maintain it. It's not a huge cost, but We don't want Ron to have to finance it all the time. So please, you can assist in a practical way there. So please get in touch with Ron if you can help.
That's not the purpose of this webinar. The purpose of the webinar is really to make people aware of this initiative, to give you to a document that you can guide your drone geophysical data collection, processing, and the like. If you're not experienced in geophysics, this is hopefully an introduction into learning more about what is needed to get good quality data. And if you are experienced, this is hopefully an opportunity for you to help improve the document, and so that we as a community are being responsible to our customer base, our broad customer base, and giving them the best quality data possible. I don't have a way of looking at the chat right now.
Just coming back to the website, one of the ways we're going to improve the website is we'll add more pages, and also we'll be reaching out to all of the main geoscience societies to have a link to this website, and we'll provide a reciprocal link back to their website. So
there we go.
Yeah, so again, if you have some influence within your professional society, please urge your society to support this initiative. And of course, all of this has cost money, and so sponsors would be great to.
Some of these questions, I'm looking in the chat now. Some of these questions we'll save for we'll answer during the panel discussion.
Just a bit of an introduction. I'm an exploration geophysicist based in Western Australia, and I've been acquiring and interpreting low level, which I sort of think of as about 10 to 20 metre high magnetic data for about 25 years now, and I've been dealing with drone magnetic data for about 5. So these are complicated topics, and the main point of this presentation is to give a taste of what kind of things are in the guidelines and examples of really why they're worthwhile to read. So there's many similarities between drone surveying and ground and mag airborne surveys. My background is mostly in relatively large exploration surveys, which really require very low noise measurements. So my talk is really biased towards these issues, but the guidelines are designed for all other types of drone magnetic surveys, as Ron's mentioned. So they all really share the same approach. So this talk will cover the subjects from 3 of the chapters in the guidelines associated with survey design, magnetic noise sources, and survey data QA/QC procedures. So really successful surveying, which keeps our clients happy, normally involves a collaboration between 3 people who each have a different role and interest. And this section of the guidelines is particularly useful for the surveyor and the technical overseer, I think. And really, unless a technical overseer is involved, contracts often get awarded based on price and availability, and really specifications sometimes quite poorly formed. So, there's many common features with manned aircraft surveys, but drones have some really distinct advantages. And I'll be focusing in this presentation on drone specific issues. Drones really span that space between slow ground surveying and high and fast airborne surveys. So, regulations are really the first place to start and vary greatly across the different jurisdictions. Planning is often severely affected by the operator permits. So if you can find operators with beyond visual line of sight, for example, it's a real game changer. And nighttime flying is another advantage. You've got cool conditions, thick air and little wind. But often, many places, particularly in Europe, you're now requiring multiple observers to keep an eye on the drone at all times. So most of the specifications are common to low-level airborne and ground surveys, but they really need to be tweaked, as we should be expecting higher quality data from drone surveys than conventional airborne surveys, particularly in areas of steep terrain. So, you know, I've outlined some of the points here in the specifications. I'm not going to go through all the details, but you can see here in the picture, this is one thing I've just highlighted. It's the issue of defining the vertical datum. So most surveyors supplied DEMS using an orthometric height. Drones generally use ellipsoidal heights, and there is an offset between them. And if it's not defined, you can end up having your surveys flown at the wrong height, and there'll be an offset. And I've had to have surveys reflown when they've been flown, you know, 15 to 20 meters off the nominal survey height. So that's just one of the things that you need to specify. It's also, I must say, very important to consider QA/QC processes in the survey specifications, some of which I'll mention later. And if you don't do this, or if you do it, really, it's more likely that there won't be any nasty surprises. So in the magnetic survey noise sources section, we're just outlining the main sources of the noise. And while this is useful for the technical supervisor, it's really critically important that surveyors understand the main noise contributors to their system so that they can always be trying to minimise the noise level. So Callum Walter has been looking into this in quite detail, and he'll be joining us on the panel a bit later if you wanted to know more details. You know, the main problem with the drone surveying is that you've got this electromagnetic and magnetic interference halo that's sort of around the drone, and it's stronger the closer you get to it. So really, depending on the sensitivity of the surveys and your magnetometers, really will determine where your magnetometer has to be positioned relative to the drone. And if you've got sensitive magnetometers and they're close to the drones, then you'll obviously need to do a lot more calibration and compensation to try to eliminate that noise source, which Rainer and Johannes will be talking a bit more about later on. So, you know, one of the main sources of noise other than that is the what we call sort of maneuver noise, really, which is caused by variations in the sensor rotation and swing as the sensor swings on the bird and vibrations. It's also, you know, there's errors and noise caused by variations in flying height. You know, one of the ability of the drones to fly a surface is really a game changer due to the reduction in this sort of flying height noise, particularly in the mountains. And of course, because the weather determines a lot of the movement of the sensor, you know, the noise is often quite weather dependent. So, and it will vary throughout the survey. So really, you know, what we need to be interested in is the survey system noise, which is just the sum of all the noise sources. And we need to be keenly aware of this and remember that it's actually a spectrum of different frequencies. And ways to assess this quantitatively are given in the next section. So the final section is about is probably most useful for the technical overseer, I'd say, who really needs to ensure that the data quality standards are suitable and are met in the survey during QA/QC processing. So these guidelines are, you know, provide a repeatability test, which is suitable for simple system noise assessment, and some other performance tests, which is good for testing the survey systems pre-mobilisation and even before you've awarded the tender, the contract. I'll go. There's a bit about noise monitoring during surveys and survey deliverables. So I'll just talk a little bit about a few of the subjects, such as this repeatability test for the system noise assessment, which is really important. So this is, you know, the total system that noise that we were mentioned earlier. And what I found to be quite effective is flying a simple box, the perimeter of a 400 by 400 metre box, 3 times anti-clockwise and 3 times clockwise. It's extremely simple, and I like keeping things simple where I can. It's key is that it's suitable for both towed sensors and airframe mounted systems. So, you know, this is really the measure that you want after. You can do this after your calibration and compensation procedures have been determined. But, you know, really this is the deliverable. This is a good way to measure the deliverable, the noise on the deliverable data. So, you know, with 400 metre size box, it's quite good because it really allows the bird to become stable in the middle of the line, and it shows the bird's swings and bird behaviour on the sharp turns. The edges should be parallel and perpendicular to the survey lines. You know, the beauty of this is that it can be done anywhere, but it's best if it's flown high, but really it's not super critical because you're really most interested in how the data repeats. You know, at normal survey speeds, about 10 metres a second, it's a very quick survey. It's all over and done within 15 minutes, and it provides this broadband noise assessment. And, you know, an additional advantage is that it gives you an early example of survey data. I found a great little variant of this is to just sort of put in virtual hills along a couple of the sides here where you know, you can test the drone's ability to climb and fly, you know, ridges and valleys, particularly steep ridges and valleys. So this is very useful for survey planning. And, you know, really, if the conditions change, it's this survey can easily be just flown again. So you can see what changes the weather has caused, and whether the noise levels are actually acceptable to the client, or whether perhaps they need to get a bit of standby time. So this is an example of one such test. You know, the positional plot shows clearly the lateral variations as the sensor swings, how sensitive the system is to wind noise, and you can also see in the lower plot where it's just showing one of the lines. You can see the ability of the drone to provide that constant height, and the horizontal lines there are about 1 metre, so you can kind of see what kind of swings you're getting on the turns and how stable the system flies and what kind of errors you should be looking at with the system. This is an example of the data from 2 of the lines, the magnetic data. You can immediately see the heading error that needs to be taken into account here, but it's really showing the survey noise levels nicely across a broad range of frequencies, many of which are relevant to geological surveying. You can see here the noise envelope is less than about 0.15 nanotesla, which is what I think that's good for relatively low noise airborne data, and the heading error is also quite low. So this is an example of good data. This is an example of a variant where I've just put in these sort of virtual gullies and ridges so that the system can be flown over and we can see how well it handles this, to just get a better idea of how low we can push with the aircraft. So this next example is really a pre-mobilisation performance test of the system. There's a lot of new systems around, and you know, I work across many different countries and jurisdictions, so it's really good to be able to understand the capabilities of the contractor's system. So what I'll often do is to take a little part of the worst section of my client's topography and just move it into the contractor's test area locally near their office and ask them to fly it. And just position it above the ground a little bit so that you know, that's it's all safe and clear. And you find a lot of interesting things in this process. This is an example where, you know, you can see that the drone actually this is around about 300 meters high, and as there was a problem with the draping algorithm here, and as you get higher, there's accumulated errors, and actually the flight path of the drone was below the topography. So this was identified a problem with the contractor's draping algorithm. They were able to fix it before they mobilised, and you know, we confirmed it was all working okay, and we didn't lose a drone in the survey area. It also is a great process to give you an example of the data quality and format that the contractors typically are supplying. So as mentioned before, the noise does vary a lot with weather. A standard way of you can see that in these different plots of the data. You can see some days where there's relatively low noise. It's due to quiet conditions, and then some other days it's better conditions. So really, you know, if you're again worried about the weather, perhaps do a box flight test and just find out whether the noise that levels provide a big enough change to sort of call standby. You know, one of the huge advantages of drones over manned aircraft is their ability to drape on a surface. And it's really exceptional, I think, to see some of these drone data sets coming out of mountainous areas. Throughout the survey, it's important to check the sensor height, not just against the contractor's elevation model, but also check it against an independent elevation model such as, you know, AW3D or the shuttle radar data set. Here's an example of you know, I do these clearance checks every few days, but particularly at the start of the survey to make sure that you know, the right datums are being used. This residual height is just equal to the survey height minus the elevation, and the nominal survey height to produce a residual. And you can see here the standard deviation is about 6 meters, which in this environment, this is in an extremely mountainous area, there's often a kilometre vertical difference between, you know, along a single line, and very steep glacial valleys. So, you know, I'm very happy with a 6 metre standard deviation on the height. As you're going along, it's always good to be able to check the data to make sure everything is working and coming through okay. second vertical derivatives are great for that. They highlight all the noise problem, a lot of the noise issues. And this is a non-leveled second vertical derivative of diagonally corrected survey data completed as part of just routine in-survey QA/QC. You know, second vertical derivative normally highlights a lot of the problems, and it shows really here an outstanding survey completed in very rugged terrain. So these are 6 or 7 kilometre lines with an 800 metre high difference between the centre and the ends of the lines. And many of these small anomalies that you can see in here, they're only half a nanotesla, and they're coherent. They're mostly, a lot of them are actually due to topographic effects, which you can only see often in very low noise data sets. So yeah, it might be a bit controversial, but I actually think I've seen some mountain surveys now in which probably the tie lines really weren't all that necessary because the contractor had developed good survey procedure. So in this section, there's also a section on survey deliverables that should be supplied by drone survey companies, which really doesn't differ that much from conventional airborne surveying. Although I would like to point out that the noise levels, I think, are still not adequately assessed or reported in most surveys, in my experience, even in conventional airborne surveying. So really, in a nutshell, good drone surveying requires a well-planned survey with a clear idea of noise levels required and clear specifications. And QA/QC measures must be included in the survey specifications. So, and you know, if people attend to the noise levels, it will result in better surveys and really hasten an improvement in standards in this emerging industry. So check out the guidelines and have a read. You know, really, this is a document that will be adjusted and updated. So if you've got other better ideas, please feel free to contact me, and we can look to include them in the in future revisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That was really good. How are we doing on time, Jeff?
Yeah, we could just do a couple of quick questions and then have about 1 or 2 minutes into our break. But there's a couple of questions here. One from Sina Sanayan: is drone noise static? If yes, can we just remove it in the data processing? We can either take that now or answer at the panel. And there was also a question about which is the best magnetometer to buy, and I referred Sina to our section 3 and table 2 of the guidelines. We don't make recommendations, at least publicly, about which are the best magnetometers, but table 2 and will help you make up your mind about that. But coming back to Sina's first question about the noise static, I think.
Paul, do you want to answer that?
Yeah. Well, the noise levels, they're higher than the signal that you want to be measuring. So you can't actually remove, and a lot of the frequencies overlap. So you can't actually just simply filter out that drone noise without filtering out data. So, you know, there's some clever ways to compensate, to remove some types of noise from the drone, but in general, there's often overlapping frequencies between the drone noise and some of the high frequency signals that you're going to be getting from real sources that you want to resolve. So you can't, you know, you've got to really be careful when you're filtering that you're not throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
Right. Actually, Caleb Walter, part of our panel, has done his PhD. I believe has done his PhD on noise that's generated by drones and how to deal with it. So he'll be part of the panel. He can probably address that question and a little bit later as well. The next speaker is Raynard. He's coming to us from Namibia, I believe. Is that where you're at?
Yes.
Okay. Raynard is actually a processing geophysicist. It's got lots of years of experience. He's one of the couple years ago, he brought up the need because of his experience for us doing the guidelines. So this whole thing, in some measure, to Raynard's efforts. Raynard, I apologize for not going into your educational and experience background, but if you want to say a few words about that, go ahead. I'm going to give you the mic.
Okay, I'm going to talk about processing of airborne UAV and MAG data and compensation and calibration. One word of advice: should you find a drone and a magnetometer under the Christmas tree, be aware that you have a very steep ladder to climb. That processes here are not magic, but there is no turnkey solution for everything. So, as Ron said, my name is Rainer Wackerle. My background is in airborne geophysical multi-client mapping. I was heavily involved in the Airborne Geophysical Survey Program of Namibia. That's also where I became a little bit obsessed with data quality, because if you have to merge 4.5 million line kilometer into one consistent data sets, you are in for some nasty surprises. So after that confession, the question whether we need compensation and data processing, is it really necessary? It's obviously answered with a sound yes, although I do admit that some exceptions exist. The reason for that is that we have changes in the ambient magnetic field, and we have disturbances from the platform. So what we are doing in geophysics is we measure, we model, we calibrate, and we correct our data. These corrections or the disturbances obviously do have different amplitudes, and therefore the accuracy to which they have to be applied changes a little bit with the magnetization of the target area. So if you have a 5,000 nanotesla target area, you probably don't need to apply a 1.5 nanotesla heading effect. Here's a practical example: raw MAG data to the left, processed MAG data to the right. A high dynamic range area on the top and the low dynamic range area on the bottom. So if you're after those structures in the high dynamic range area, you probably don't need to do processing, although it does change or does improve the appearance of the final grid. You maybe get away with only the raw data. However, don't do any derivatives on that, because it's turning ugly. In the low dynamic range, you do have to apply the whole suite of processing to get an interpretable map. One caution here, and Paul touched on that already: please take care of your height keeping, because many striations in data are actually caused by neighboring lines flown at different heights. The top shows the height of the survey, and the bottom is the diagonally and IGF corrected MAG data. Lots of these small striations are actually caused by neighboring lines flown at different heights. The magnitude of the height effects depends on obviously on the strength of the magnetic anomalies in the target area. And as a ballpark figure, you could say if you are 10% off the nominal terrain clearance, you are between 3 and 5% off in your MAG as well. So here is that's my processing workflow of 1 kilohertz MAG data. I'm going to talk about the processing here, which I call the standard toolbox, and then at the end about the compensation, which is slightly different. So some of those corrections are based on physics, and others, like the leveling processes, are cosmetic nature. First, we have to clean flight path. It needs to be broken into individual lines with unique line numbering, and the lines have to be cropped carefully to the survey area. Here are 2 tile boundaries from the same survey. In the left case, the data do overlap nicely. They're nicely cropped, and there's a tie in between the overlap. And the right survey, they're also neatly cropped. There also is a tie, but for whatever reason, the one tile is offset by half the line spacing, which at the end gave a couple of problems, specifically in the gridding process. Be that as it may, if you deliver something like that, you didn't do your homework. Diurnal variations are measured by a static magnetometer or base station and subtracted from the production data. Here is a non-so-normal diurnal, It starts very smoothly at the beginning of the day, and suddenly a magnetic storm hits the Earth, and we get high frequency and high anomaly variations. All the data that are flown during a magnetic storm have to be scrapped and reflown, basically due to phase shifts of those anomalies. But if you're lucky, you go from there to there. This is a textbook example. It's usually not that nice. The International Geomagnetic Reference Field is a mathematical model. It does vary in time slowly. That's why it's often referred to as secular variations. However, in some parts of the world, IGF can vary about or more than 50 nanotesla per year, which basically means you come back a week later and you're already 1 nanotesla off. IGF also varies with height. So what we do, we calculate the time, the IGF for the time, date and time of data acquisition and the elevation. Lag is basically the difference, or lag or parallax is basically the difference between the GPS position and the sensor. So if you have herringboning all over the place, you have a lag. You identify the lag by flying back and forth over a very sharp anomaly, and then you drag those anomalies along the timeline until they fit on top of each other and position-wise, and you apply that lag and you get quite some nice data. Heading correction is basically a directional DC shift applied in each of the 4 cardinal survey directions. We get the heading out of a test flight. Test flight takes shape of a clover leaf oriented in the cardinal direction of the survey, and from the central crossover point we can deduct our directional heading effects. The heading flight must be undertaken in a magnetically quiet environment, and the data must be diagonally corrected. 2 notes here. Heading errors can also be determined from Paul's repeatability test. And the second one is the heading correction is applied using the positional direction of the platform sensor. It does not correct for directional effects originating from the yaw variations of the sensor. So it has nothing to do with compensation. After all the corrections, we still have line parallel striations, and we remove them, or almost all of them, by a process called tie line leveling. The process makes use of tie or control lines flown usually perpendicular to the traverses. At each crossover, we have 2 measurements, so and they differ. That is called the misclosure or mistie. And from all these misclosures, we calculate a correction curve, which is usually done by polynomial fitting. So in the example below, you do see the misclosures as the red boxes, and the final correction value calculated as the black line. Tie line leveling is a cosmetic process, and it's the largest source of long wavelength artifacts if you don't apply it carefully. However, it can remove drift in the data that then refers to that, so it can also remove a diurnal variation. So here is before and after tie line leveling from the same data you've seen before. You don't see that much here, so I put another example in before tie line leveling and after tie line leveling, so it does work. At the end, there are, however, still subtle line parallel striations in the data, and these striations are removed by a process called micro-leveling. The striations are isolated from the tie line level grid by applying a low pass filter along the traverses and the high pass filter across, and then the correction grid is read back into the line data and applied. The micro-leveling is also a cosmetic tool. It smoothes the data slightly, and it can remove geological signal from structures that are parallel or subparallel to the flight directions. So always check the correction grid. Here is on the left is our tie line level grid, and that is the correction grid. So you do see along those north-south lines, north-south features, there are corrections found that actually do remove geological signal. However, you can overcome that a little bit by restricting the magnitude of your correction grids, but always have a look at your correction grid. And it actually does work because it produces the final magnetic data. So we dealing a lot with grids, and so we have to talk a little bit about the gridding. Gridding interpolates all gaps between the lines. to achieve a complete coverage. Here is a color-coded line data set, and there's a corresponding grid. The task is not necessarily trivial because we have highly sampled data along the lines, and they have to be interpolated over the relatively large voids between the lines. There are several gridding procedures out there. In airborne geophysics, we use bicubic splining and minimum curvature most frequently. There are many parameters in those gridding algorithms, but the most important is the cell size. A larger cell size produces a smoother grid, but can obscure subtle anomalies, whereas a very small cell size can actually make the gridding process falling apart. Common cell sizes are a fourth or fifth of line data spacing. Just a word to oblique line data sets, because the grid is always oriented north-south or east-west, and the effective line spacing in east-west direction is obviously larger than the nominal line spacing. Just keep that in mind. Finally, we have to come to platform influences and the removal thereof, which we call the compensation. First, we have to accept that all platforms do influence the magnetic data we record, regardless of their size. So we have remnant magnetization and induced magnetization, and if there's any conductive material on board of the platform, and moving that through the magnetic field, we produce eddy currents. All of those change with the attitude of the platform center system and the strength and the direction of the magnetic field. Now we have to look at two different magnetometer types: total field sensors and vector mags. And I'd like to start with the vector mags. If we skip the squid mags, then vector mags are three orthogonal flux gates. And flux gates have to be calibrated anyway due to a whole series of issues, starting with the fact that they are actually relative meters. So if you rotate the vector mag on the spot, then the TMI vector length describes an ellipsoid instead of a sphere. To eliminate these errors, so-called scalar calibration is applied, which, according to Munchi, also removes the remnant and the induced magnetization from the platform. Here's a graphical impression of one of these calibration processes. And if we accept, or if we believe that in a copter drone, there aren't that many eddy currents, or they're not that important, then we can tick off, from the point of view of compensation, we can tick off the vector mags. Total field sensors, on the other hand, are hardly ever compensated. To reduce the platform influences, the sensor is simply suspended below the platform, and very often the suspension length is insufficient to attenuate all platform influences. So we still have to compensate. So here is an example of a classic compensation flight: mag or raw in red, and compensated mag in green, the high pass filtered version in the middle panel, and the compass channels in the bottom. Compensation flight has 4 legs, each of the 4 cardinal survey directions, and you perform a series of maneuvers, roll, pitch, and yaw maneuvers, and they give rise to maneuver noise in the raw magnetic data. And the idea is to bring that noise levels basically down, ideally down to 0. There also is a DC effect involved in the compensation. So what we are doing, we're taking the data from the maneuvers, so some take the entire compensation flight and feed them into a lot of equations according to Leliak. And after we solve that, the equations, we get a series of compensation coefficients, which basically model the magnetic expression of the platform with respect to its attitude towards the ambient magnetic field. This is already a fairly complex process, and in suspended systems, that complex is exacerbated because we have attitude changes of the platform sensor system within the ambient magnetic field, and we have and the position of the sensor within the disturbing field of the platform can change. On top of it, the sensor itself may have an attitude effect. So that problem is, according to my knowledge, not solved yet. So as a result, we have a lot of maneuver noise in common-based copter drone data. And here's an extreme example. MAG is shown in blue and the vertical attitude channels in red, total field MAG, high-pass filtered MAG, and force difference. What happened here is that on the left in the turn, to the left of the line in the turn, the sensor actually flipped and then was dragged along, wildly bouncing up and down, as you can see here at the attitude channels, creating a hell of a lot of MAG noise in the data. Then after a while, towards the end of the line, it actually flipped back into a nominal position, and the magnetic data are still are much noisier, are much more quiet, although there is still a little bit of noise visible. So let's have a look at the standard line, no flipping, no nothing, no wind, just a smooth line, and have a look at the high pass filtered magnetic data that are recorded and compare those to the compass data. And in my opinion, there's absolute clear correlation between the two. That this correlation exists actually raises the hope that we may reduce the noise by doing post-mission compensation, either by a correlation approach or maybe by total field by machine learning approach. So what we can do since that problem isn't solved yet, the only thing we can do is mount the sensor rigidly to the platform, because then naturally the point 2 falls away and points 1 and 3 are combined. And that this can be done is shown in the next example here. So that is a compensation slide which took shape of a clover leaf. It was flown at 5,000 feet altitude, so there's no geology in here, no geological noise. So we have the raw MAG in blue and the compensated MAG in red. And at the central crossover point, the directional differences were reduced from about 40 nanotesla to below 1 nanotesla, which is quite good. The platform used is fixed, rigidly mounted. There are two sensor pairs in each of the wingtips. What we couldn't do is actually compensate the gradient, but the total field MAG was compensated well. This initiative was launched by a large exploration company, and they want to basically replace costly manned airborne surveys. But this is basically besides the point, because if we can compensate this and we can compensate the vector MAG system, then there's absolutely no reason why we cannot successfully compensate a copter drone based total field system. And this was done by a group around a guy called Kaup last year, and they published their results. They did their own software, and it reduces the maneuver noise quite well. But I think there's still a bit of room for improvement for that specific system. So finally, I was talking about mainly the standard toolbox. Standards because most, if not all, non-seismic geophysical data processing packages do have the necessary tools implemented. That does not hold true for the compensation. So it's all in there. There's nothing really fundamentally new. You just have to apply it, although it can be quite tricky at times. So in case you have no geophysical background, try to team up with a geophysicist or go through training or introduction courses available online from many software developers, at least the larger ones. So yeah, I apologize for rushing through the whole thing. You can download the recording later and watch it at your own leisure, at your own pace. But this is a big topic, so we can fill 2 or 3 days of workshop as well if we go into more detail. So thank you for listening, and enjoy processing.
Thank you very much, Rainer. I think you hit a lot of the important aspects of what it takes to actually get good, clean drone data from just through the processing process. It's not simple. And I'm glad that you also made the comment about that it also is somewhat a function of the target you're looking for. If you've got 1,000 nanotesla anomaly, you may not have to process to that detail. But if you're looking for geologic mapping, usage for the drone mag data, then it becomes an important part of it.
Thanks, Ron, and good morning, afternoon, evening, or whatever time of day it is for everybody on the call. It's great to be part of this initiative. Folk have worked really hard, and thank you everybody for your support of this event. Well, I'm going to be speaking about the imaging and interpretation part of the guidelines, and I just want to give a shout out to my co-author on these sections, Bruno Gavazzi. He's not able to be with us today, but he and I've thrown ideas around and worked on this together. So it's Bruno and myself, but I'm in the hot seat today, talking about imaging and interpretation, sections 12 and 13 in the guidelines. I'm actually going to be talking to you about all of this. But the good news is I'm not going to kill you off with it here online. It's all in the guidelines, and imaging starts on page 84, and interpretation starts on page 88. And what I'm planning to do today is not going to deep detail in the way that the written content does, but just take you through some of the headlines, some of my personal impressions of things that are worth looking out for, and really building on the work of previous speakers. I've been an exploration geophysicist for 25 years. I've had the privilege of working in a lot of countries. A lot of that's been with magnetic data, some of it airborne, some ground-based. And for the last 10 years or so, I've been keeping an eye on developments in drone space, and I'm really excited about what I'm seeing. You know, what's not to love about it, having a drone and strapping a magnetometer on underneath it? But there are some caveats, and one of the primary aims of this guideline is to point people to best practice, as Jeff's pointed out, and to make sure that we're understanding the pitfalls and managing those where we can. So this section really builds on that whole philosophy. And if you know what you're doing, get on and do it. If you don't know what you're doing, reach out. This is now a community. That is the function of this committee and these guidelines, so that we benefit each other. So imaging is really about what have we got. We've done all the hard work. We've bought the drone. We've strapped on the magnetometer. We've done the survey planning. We've got the data in the right place. We've done the processing. What have we got? And there's a few things to watch out for. There's any number of ways of presenting drone magnetic data, typically in grid, so spatial 2D format, and we'll all understand the grid measurements. As Rainer pointed out, we're not actually observing these images. We're observing a small subset of it along the survey lines. Nobody can fly an area as tight spaced as they like. The economics just don't bear that out. So in the survey design stage, we're always thinking about how broad can we go to save money versus how tight can we go to preserve signal. And so grid is at some levels a poor version of representing that spatially, because a lot of this is interpolated, and it matters how you do that interpolation. Rainer's touched on that. I'm not going to go into that here. What I am going to talk about is the way we present the data visually is important as well. And here's some pretty pictures. So a grayscale, color scale, bottom is contours. Contours can still be useful. I sometimes use them to overlay one data set on another. So I'll put terrain on top of the mag and it stops me making silly decisions. Color shading can help to illuminate structures at particular orientations. And there's a trap there as well that I'll come to in a moment. So any number of ways. And something that's increasingly, well, it's always been important, but I think increasingly being attended to, is that our eye, naturally as humans, we are trained that red is danger, blue is okay, and green and yellow probably don't matter particularly much. So if your eyes are anything like my eyes, on the left-hand image, you immediately look at the reds, and you probably ignore the turquoise and the blue. That's not a good choice, because maybe the turquoise and the blue is what you're looking for. On the right-hand image, we've got here perceptually uniform color tables. Covesi and others have done a lot of work on these, and these are available for your download. We're getting a more faithful visual representation of the full spectrum of high, mid-range, and low values. So think about color table. It matters. You can miss things. You can overemphasize things if you're not aware of what your eyes are telling you. Next up is the color stretch itself, and I've just put some thoughts here. Most folk will use equal area, and that's great because it's kind of an AGC, an automatic gain correction. It spreads the color table evenly between the grid values. But I, more than some, tend to use linear as well, because that shows me some of the subtle features that can be wiped out by the equal area. And normal distribution, we don't see quite as much because our statistics aren't always Gaussian. And so, you know, folk do use it when a grid is well behaved and values uniformly distributed around a central value. So just worth thinking about the color stretch. Again, I often say to folk when I'm giving training courses or what have you, this is a lot like you're driving along in your car and you're tuning your radio signal and perhaps you want classical music, so you move the dial and you get the classical music, or you want something a bit sort of pop music, or end of the journey you want some banging rock, whatever. All of those signals are out there in the ether, and what we're doing with tuning the dial there is we're emphasizing the signal we're interested in, and we're attenuating the signal that we're not. So collection of good geophysical data is essential. And what we're doing here is just tuning the dial to focus in on the features we're interested in and tuning out the features that we're less interested in. Directional shading is a bit of a soapbox of mine, but I think with good reason. It certainly makes images look pretty. You know, it's more fun to look at a directionally shaded image. And what I'm talking about here is so we pretend that the magnetic field is a terrain surface, and we put the sun up at sort of top right on the left-hand image, or at top left on the right-hand image. And, you know, it brings out features. That's great. The problem is that it preferentially emphasizes features that are perpendicular to the sun strike, and preferentially attenuates features that are parallel. Two examples from this image that make the point, if they pop up. Can we see here that on the left-hand image, there's a clear set of what could be important sub-north-south trending dikes, and they're almost completely missing from the right-hand image. That's not because they aren't there, it's because we've been persuaded by the sunshade. Down here in the bottom left, we're noticing some really interesting features trending sort of northwest, southeast. Only problem is those same features are trending northeast, southwest in the right-hand side of the image. So when you're getting into subtlety, be careful. By all means, use sun shading, but use at least 2 different illuminations. And then image combination is so powerful. Just some snapshots from sort of recent projects we've been involved in. Obviously, we're putting, top left happens to be geochem over a gray shaded mag image. Top right is mag draped on terrain. Top left is actually radiometrics, but it can equally be used for different variants of magnetic, or I've seen it used for different variants of gravity data, and 3D imaging, of course, is a whole topic of discussion and world of its own. So we can combine images. Let's be careful how we do that. Let's make sure that we understand the signatures that we're seeing and that we're understanding the value they're bringing. And I will just say at this point, although a lot of these slides are peculiar to geologic mapping, they all pertain to shallow near surface, to UXO, to, you know, in the UXO, the pipeline space, we have the debatable luxury of features that are highly magnetic and in strong contrast to the background. So sometimes we can get away, as has been alluded to earlier, with a lower intensity of processing. But personally, and I think a lot of us in this audience would rather process the data well and then realize we didn't need to, than process the data poorly and miss things that are important. So if imaging is what have we got, then interpretation is what does it mean? And again, this is a big topic, so I'll try and skim over the top of it. What we've done in this guideline is we've chosen to group data interpretation into the data space. So 1D profile-based interpretation, 2D grid-based, and 3D voxel-based. And each of those, again, is a big topic in itself, but I'll try and do justice to them in brief now, and I'd refer you to the guidelines for a closer look at all of these. Just an introduction, there's a number of challenges that we face in the magnetic space, and I just want to touch on those for those of you who are not familiar with them, and perhaps to remind those of you that are. The first is this idea of model ambiguity. Those of us who've been in the game a bit know that one of the limitations of the magnetic signal is that the observed signal can be equally generated by a whole range of subsurface geometries. And this is a slightly humorous example where these two authors obviously got sick and tired of this ambiguity and modeled a fairly famous magnetic anomaly in Lausanne, Switzerland, as a question mark. And then what they rather facetiously say at the bottom is, we now propose a new model. Calculations show that it takes full account of the measured anomaly. From this point of view, it's considerably better than most of its predecessors. Besides that, this model is in harmony with at least one of the characteristics of the local geology, i.e. it is highly puzzling. So I think it's a really useful example of needing to keep our brains in gear when we're doing this kind of work. How do we reduce this ambiguity? Well, there are ways to do that. We can clearly discard nonsensical solutions, features that are incredibly deep or at least explorationally incredibly deep out of our range of interest. We're just not interested in those. Very shallow features as well, we can do something about perhaps from surface observation. But an additional constraint is to put in any extra information we've got. Have we got geology? Have we got boreholes? Have we got geochem? Have we got satellite imagery? And all of these can help to shrink the model space so that the ambiguity is diminished. This is a problem, this is a challenge, it is a frustration, but it can be managed provided we're thoughtful about what we're doing. The second one is this idea that the Earth's magnetic field is not, or the ambient field is not the same everywhere on the planet. The Earth to first order has a dipole, a bar magnet at its center, if you will. And so we need to take account of that. This is the same blob of geology imaged at 3 different locations on the planet. Komsomolets Island happens to be currently about the nearest land location to the North Magnetic Pole. Western Azerbaijan, obviously at moderate latitude, Northern Hemisphere, and Lima's on the magnetic equator. If we take a magnetometer and put the same block of rock in the ground, we will measure these 3 completely different curves at these 3 locations. Now, again, this may make some of you panic if you're not into magnetic interpretation, but this is a problem that is well understood. We have what Rainer referred to as the IGRF, the International Geomagnetic Reference Field. We understand it. We understand to a good order how it changes over time, so this can be corrected. But I have worked with commercial geoscientists who want to drill into the magnetic high because it's next to the magnetic low and there's nothing in the magnetic low. That is the wrong answer. Those are 2 parts of the same signal. The magnetic high and low belong together. What goes up must come down. Think about it, please, and use this in your work, because if you don't, you will get into difficulties. I've spoken about the flavors of interpretation, and as ever, there are strengths and weaknesses all around. So profile-based gives us almost continuous signal along the line of travel. You know, modern sensors, we can collect pretty much any frequency we like. 1 kilohertz, come on, 1,000 readings a second, brilliant. Useful, maybe less so, but certainly impressive. But it's sensitive to lateral effects. If an anomaly is offline, we won't be able to anticipate that in profile-based inter. Grid-based assesses sources in both X and Y, but gridding smooths and interpolates, as I pointed out. It's also difficult to assess depth. There are techniques that we can use for that. Voxel-based interpretation really is, if you will, the Rolls-Royce. And it's great for assessing sources in 3D, but without heavy computing power, which of course is becoming less of a constraint with cloud-based work now, but specifically without a priori geological controls, something to reduce that ambiguity, people can come up with extraordinary results and really make poor exploration decisions. And as I say, that matters a lot if you're digging a 50-pound bomb out of the surface. It matters a lot if you're finding minerals at 500 or petroleum at 5 kilometers. The pitfalls are the same, and we need to think these through. Just in brief then, 1D interp, there's a range of techniques. This is a famous image from an early paper by Hartmann et al. This was one of the first examples of computer automation for geophysical interpretation. And again, pointers in the guidelines. There's an extensive list of references for those of you who are interested. 2D interp, I won't talk in detail. There's a whole washing list down the left-hand side. These are tools that as a gravity mag interpreter, a non-seismic interpreter, I use all day, every day. And it's a long list. There are benefits and advantages and caveats. What we've tried to do in the guidelines is give a sort of quick summary of all of these, but I'll just lift one image prepared by my colleague Bruno, and again showing along the top there, same features in the ground in France, Canada, and Australia, with a different inclination, declination of the magnetic field, different depths, and unsurprisingly, the deeper you go, that middle line, the smaller the signal amplitude. And then remnant magnetization kicking in that bottom slide. I'm not talking about remnants in today's presentation, but if you're interested, it's in section 2.5 of the guidelines, and it matters. Broadly, there are two families of magnetization. One is induced, that's related to the Earth's current field. The other is remnant, that's magnetization that's locked up from previous phases of Earth activity. And if you were to switch off the Earth's dipolar field, you'd still see the remnant magnetization. And what the problem with it is we don't know what direction it points. So we have to allow for that as far as possible in our modeling. The induced magnetization we understand from the IGRF, we can compensate for that. The remnants is more difficult. But as I say, a whole bunch of 2D interp tools that we use, and those are in the guidelines for you to look through at your convenience. 3D, everybody loves 3D. It's great, it's spatial, it's intuitive, and there's a ton of caveats. You know, how much control have we got? How have we constrained the model? What amount of fitting? Are we overfitting, underfitting? What are our assumptions? Have we got any geology? And there's a bunch of commercial softwares that'll help you with this, a bunch of open source as well, and those are in the guidelines for your reference. Geophysical versus geological. So as geophysicists, we crunch numbers. As geologists, we find ore deposits and hopefully, or ticking bombs or spatial infrastructure in the shallow subsurface. Hopefully, the geologists are talking to the geophysicists are talking to the geologists, and we get this right. But downhole geophysics, so go close to the source if you can, integration of other geophysical data sets, specialist collaboration, team approach, ground truthing, let's go out and see what we've got on site, and iterative interpretation are all important. We don't want to end up with a scenario like the right-hand side of this slide, where we're just making things up. And so my closing plea really, and something that I've had to learn sometimes the hard way in my career, is let's work with our brains in gear. The most important geophysical tool on any exploration or investigation project is your human brain. Drones are great. We're all in this call because we believe that, we know it, and the strides that we're making now are phenomenal and are exciting to me personally, I think to many of us. But the most important component is the human brain. And if you know what you're doing, please get on with it. If you don't know what you're doing, please reach out to those of us in the community who are able to help. We want to get this right. It's good for us. It's good for the clients. It's good for our science. And thanks very much for your attention.
Very good, Tim. Are there any questions for Tim?
I have a question, if you don't mind, Tim.
Surely.
What do you think about histogram equalized stretch?
Yeah, so that's the equal area that I spoke of, Jeff. It's great,
okay.
And it's used almost universally, and it is not ideal. If I want to isolate a particular portion of my range, I'll tend to clip it and use a linear stretch just across that short range. So your histogram equalization, what I call the equal area, is commonly employed, but it does have dangers, and we just need to be aware of those.
Yeah, I find it very useful for bringing the brightness out in radiometrics ternary images.
Yeah. So radiometrics, you're often looking a little more qualitatively. It's rude, and my radiometric colleagues will shoot me, but you're looking for highs and lows. Whereas in a mag image, often you're looking for more analytical solutions. So where the amplitude exceeds a certain value, or depending, I'm trying to scan the whole market. We've got all the way through from UXO, where something like analytic signal, which is the total magnetic gradient amplitude, is used quite effectively. UXO is not the toughest target to spot. It's more about logistics. And as Ron pointed out, sometimes that's going more to EM because you can now characterize the sources as well as detect them. Through the infrastructure detection, yeah, you'll see some of that. There's various tools can be used. The subtle end really is the geologic mapping that, as Ron says, is the main share. There's reasonable amount of money in that space. One thing that not everybody thinks about is we actually use the same drone magnetic sensor to image all the way from surface down to several kilometers. And so it is important. And if I'm acquiring a data set or commissioning a data set, I'd like it to be fit for purpose, even beyond its immediate tenure. So fine, we're looking for something shallow, but what if we come back and decide either we've got some deeper structures in the ground that are bothering us infrastructure-wise, or we want to look a bit deeper in the exploration context. We decide, price of copper goes up, we can start to see a bit deeper, extract ore a bit deeper. Let's collect the best data we possibly can, and then it's links in the chain. So good system design, good acquisition, good processing, good inter. It's just going to be the best choice.
Man, you got me convinced.
That's the plan, bro.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. In a way, that kind of wraps up what we're really trying to achieve here is get information from the data that that is appropriate for the objective, whether it be a resource exploration problem or identifying something that is buried in the subsurface that needs to be either avoided or extracted. Well, thank you, all the speakers up until now. We'll see you all in about 8 minutes. I have that as 7:10 here in Denver.
Yeah, what I would like to strengthen is what can we recommend for newcomers or novelists in drone geophysics? Yeah, and in particular, I think I would like to emphasize the question about the resolution, the maximum resolution that is achievable with the current existing technology. I mean, what is the best sensor we recommend? Is there any experience from us, from the board, from us who have tried to achieve best resolution in the past 10 years or 5 years? Maybe it's worth to summarize and to present our experience in this particular field of experience.
Boy,
what is the best sensor? Do we know already? It seems everybody is very much convinced about the type of sensor he has been used in the past. But this is more or less maybe a personal flavor.
Yeah, I think that's a real difficult question to really address. That is, what is the best sensor? I think all of them have their qualities and are, you know, pluses and minuses. So I would be, in large part, the reason I would be loath to actually say what the best sensor is because I have my own bias, and I don't think that's what I should be sharing. But at least not in a open forum like this, at least generally. Maybe Paul has a different opinion.
I don't own a magnetometer, except for the ones in my mobile phone. But
Yeah.
So
Well, Paul,
I really like
example.
the rubidium and the potassium mags. They're I reckon they've got the lowest noise, and they've got very small, very small dead zones. So you don't get kind of noise when things spin around too much. So that's just my the Geonyx mag and there's a couple of rubidium.
I tell you, let's start off the discussion with that question, and then whoever's on the panel can that wants to answer it, because I will certainly chime in. And
Well, don't forget we've got table 2 in the document, which covers all that, so you could share that on the screen. And the MagArrow, you've got 2 sensors, then that gets around the problem of 1 sensor, right?
It does, but there's also there's an ongoing sort of controversy about sample rates too, and I haven't. So the sample rates are important, and that one has to look at that as well. But what other, just as a sort of a C question, I in running this session, Leslie, do you have something that you want to say for a few minutes about safety issues or anything else?
Probably not directly. I mean, most of the things with safety, it really boils down to risk assessment. It's really hard to just say, well, if you follow A, B, and C, this is going to work, because there's so much variation internationally. Like I can say, oh, in Australia, you can't do A, B, and C, and unless you have permits. But I think what was brought up before was pilot training, certification, the actual certification, not only of the operator, but the actual operations, because a lot of what we do in geophysics and drone operation is above what you would do normal. So it might be like, oh, you can't go above 400 feet and you can't fly at night and you can't fly beyond vision of sight. But of course, all those things don't apply when you start doing airborne geophysics because they get permits for it. So, some of the rules that are in place, they all have to have permits to do, or you can't fly over populous areas or near aerodromes. But I think no matter where you go, it's that the operation itself has to be certified. The operation has to have permits for that specific operation because they're so unique and they're so different than regular. You're not out taking real estate photos. You're doing survey, which is a little bit different. So if you have those permits, and those should be able to be shown to whoever's operating, whether it's an explorationist or a geologist or a geophysicist, they should be able to show that type of documentation. And they should be able to proudly show why it's done and why it's approved. Not just like, she'll be right, mate. It's got to be in writing. They should be able to show it to the companies that are contracting them so they can show that they're doing a good job.
I would love to hear you tell us about your background and what you do in the drone space. Can you do that for us?
Okay, so, well, my background in aviation has been since I was very young. So that part hasn't changed. I've been involved in drones probably in the last 5 years. I'm a drone pilot as well as a chief pilot. And I have my own REOC, which means I'm actually an organized, approved organization for drone operations. So, and in addition to that, I'm also a BARS auditor. So I did the training for that. So I've been kind of following the industry and been involved. And before then, I was involved with geophysics probably for about 11 years. So I understand the applications and why it's important, and the data side, not just the airborne side, that they're connected and they're very important to each side. So that's probably a little bit about my background without getting into too much.
Okay. Were you aviation pilot for a pilot on board air mag survey aircraft or things like that? That's how you've been initially involved with the geophysical data collection?
Initially, I was involved actually as an operator. So I joined from an electronics point of view. So I used to look after all the equipment for survey and operation and maintenance and operating all the equipment. I was also a pilot, so I used to do flying to and from, but I never used to do the survey. I would let someone else do that so I could look after the equipment. But, we always worked as a team. So, and I've worked all over the place from Asia to South America, North America, all over the place. So, yeah, I feel pretty comfortable in the geophysical area.
Leslie, with your background in aviation and geophysics and drones, what are the maybe top 3, top 4 items that you would think people should focus on when it comes to safety and executing drone mag surveys in particular?
I think the biggest thing is to first to understand that there's a lot of variation between country. So one set of rules doesn't work for everywhere. You really, I think we brought that up before. If it doesn't look right, it's probably not right.
Right.
You need to focus on, I guess, the certification of the company you're dealing with, if the country allows it. I've been in some places in Africa and it's just like, go talk to Jim. There is absolutely no regulations, where other areas it's quite strict and quite outlined. ICAO, which is the international body for aviation safety, they do have an outline now, which they give freely to countries that don't have requirements. So that does give a little more structure to it. Unfortunately, a lot of the laws that are out there for general use, they're really directed at general operators. So, don't fly above 400 meters, beyond, be on site, all these things that they're kind of directed at the guys doing real estate photos. They're not directed at the guys doing specialty work such as this. We're dealing with bigger drones. We're dealing with beyond line vision. We're dealing with sometimes night. We're dealing with weather. We're dealing with all sorts of different things. And there's a lot more risks involved, like things like, you know, I've seen very small drones take the heads off birds. Bigger drones can be quite dangerous. People really need to understand that they can be dangerous. And, you know, they get really close to them and it's like, don't get close to them. These things with those blades, they can take your fingers off or even worse quite easily. They need to have a respect. People have a respect around a helicopter or an aircraft. They need to have the same respect for these machines. They can be quite dangerous, but they can also be an awesome tool. So there's a respect on both sides. They're not just dangerous, they're really, really useful, but they have to be respected. And I think that, you know, people, they need to look at them with the same sense as they would a small aircraft, basically, when they're up there, you know, what else is in the area? Are there other aircraft? Are there mines? Are there, you know, explosives? Are there other things going on in the areas that we should consider? So the same as you would do a risk assessment for whether it be, you know, some type of mining operation or drilling or small aviation, you still need to do it for a drone. There's a lot of things that can impact it, but we can get really, really great data and really concentrated data. So it's an excellent opportunity. You know, I love it. We don't have people on board, which is, you know, removes a huge risk for survey. And the data can be really focused and concentrated in areas of interest. So I see both sides of it. You know, I see the risks, but I can also see the benefits. But people really need to focus on, you know, the type of risks that need to be identified and how they can mitigate them. So if they do that, they're going to end up with something I think is really great.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. I think you hit the sort of the nail on the head. Is that the risk assessment of a flight operation, a data collection, a survey, is really a key part of the whole process of getting it done and getting it done safely and avoiding any incidents or any issues like that. And I think the second thing that's important to realize that you said was that that every country has its own sort of thing. Some of them are regulations, some of them are pretty tight and engaged, and others are pretty loose and don't quite have it done yet. The U.S. itself has some regs that we follow. One of the things that I see, I'm making a little bit of a comment here on what you said, is that very often people look, other countries look to the U.S. to sort of develop the template for what they're going to implement. That is what we see happening in the U.S. right now is that within the next year to 2 to 3 years, it really depended on what the FAA, the governing body for the national airspace, does. What we see is that we're going to have beyond visual line of sight permits, but it's going to require the FAA signing off on technologies that allow that to happen. That's really what I want to make a point, is that you really do, yeah, and I'm glad that you're part of our committee and helping us with the safety part of it, is that you really do want to make sure that we're all compliant to the local regs, but more importantly, we're also using our common sense to do the proper risk assessments and avoid incidents, avoid crashes, avoid the loss of human life. That we should never have that kind of thing to deal with. So I'm going to continue with a question. Thank you, Leslie. I'm going to move back to what our pre-panel discussion was, and that is Johannes had a few words to say about a few things, and I'm going to turn it over to Johannes. Johannes Stahl is a geophysicist based in Germany. Johannes, I'll let you take the floor, and you can explain who you are and where you're going with it.
Yeah, I'm a geophysicist, and I founded my company in 2011, so 11 years ago, and I did already a lot of projects concerning airborne MAC using different types of drones. On bigger drones, 75 kilogram drones, and also fixed wing drones. We are developing our own multicopters because we try to optimize them in order to carry a maximum weight, payload, and optimize the endurance. Important for us was to find a magnetometer that can be carried by small drones. This is the reason why I focus mainly on flux gate sensors. Also, flux gates are known to the type of magnetometer that probably gives the least resolution of all other magnetometers being used in airborne geophysics. By consequently studying the sources of errors of flux gates, we were able to achieve resolution better than 1 nanotesla. The advantage of flux gate sensors is they are extremely lightweight compared to other types of scalar magnetometers. So we were able to carry on a 10 kilogram multicopter 5 sensors at the same time, which is a superior configuration to detect small objects, mainly bombs. So also we know there are many other applications, mainly in the exploration industry, that require highest resolution. So Paul Mutton already stressed that it would be better to use what was it, potassium magnetometer, because that shows highest resolution. So in summary, I would like to strengthen that currently we haven't achieved in drone geophysics the same quality that is being achieved with ground measurements and also by traditional airborne platforms, manned aircrafts or helicopters. So I think there is still a lot of room to become, or we have to remedy this anyhow. So I really encourage everybody working in drone geophysics to think about strategies to improve this in the near future. My company also are now marketing EM measurements on drones. We released a so-called semi-airborne EM system in 2018 and had already some success on the market. This is an idea I already had more than 10 years ago, because I was most triggered by a paper published by Richard Smith from Laurentian University. It was published in Geophysics in 2001, and it was on comparing semi-airborne TEM measurements with ground measurements and airborne traditional airborne measurements using a large loop placed on ground. And I think he already recognized the big advantages of using semi-airborne EM measurements against ground measurements, which are very slow and costly, and airborne, purely airborne measurements, which cannot achieve the same depth of penetration and also more costly compared with semi-airborne measurements. But we are still facing the same problem with the resolution, because the noise of the drone generated by a drone is still a huge problem, which involves to invent different strategies to suspend the sensor below the drone. I know some geophysicists use very long suspension lines to tow a sensor 20 meters below a drone. This might help to annihilate or to completely eliminate the noise generated by the drone, but I find it quite impractical, especially if you want to apply this sensor in near surface problems. This might help in exploration projects where you traditionally fly several tens of meters above surface. But if you want to deploy a magnetic sensor on near surface problems, which usually involves the sensor to be a few meters above ground to avoid the geometrical problem from a target, it is very impractical. So finally, I think all of us have to think about a noise-free drone, and we have to improve or we have to eliminate or find a way how to eliminate the noise of the drone. And this involves a much better understanding of the sources, of the noise sources of the drone. I think Callum Wortham may tell us more about possible strategies for the future.
Excellent lead into giving Callum a chance to visit on the noise issues that he's studied for the last several years. Thank you, Johannes. Callum, do you have a little bit to say?
Yeah, I can say some things quick here just as we wrap up and get into the discussion. So my name's Callum Alter. I'm currently with the USGS and NASA as a postdoctoral research fellow. My PhD thesis, however, was kind of developing drone aeromagnetic systems, and a lot of the chapters of my thesis are published papers, which you can download for free online at the Queen's QSpace website. So what's my specialization in drone magnetics? It has been looking at the electromagnetic interference signal, so I'll expand on these a little bit. So the main thing we want to understand with the electromagnetic interference signals is there's this halo around the drone. Closer to it, you're going to have higher amplitude signals, where moving further away, you have less. And what we want to try and do is suspend the sensor at a distance where the sensor is no longer sensitive to the signals that are being sensed. One of the best ways to do this is to measure it through what's called a vertical buzz test, where we have the drone above the magnetometer, which we leave stationary on the ground, and then we buzz it down on top of it, measuring the distance with a laser altimeter. Again, just looking at this vertical buzz test quickly, we would do something like this, buzz it down until the magnetometer becomes sensitive to this electromagnetic interference. And what the results of this would look like would be something like this, where we have our laser altimeter measurements on the top, and then we can correlate this to when we start measuring the drone interference based on this distance away from the magnetometer. So this is what we want to try and understand. And then when we determine where this offset distance is, this would be where you'd ideally want to place your magnetometer at this correct suspension length. This is going to be very independent on the specific type of drone you use, as well as the specific magnetometer you use. So it's going to be unique for each location. Now, a little bit more about these electromagnetic interference signals. The first one that we've been able to kind of look at in depth in a lot of the academic publications, which I come from, is from a Canadian group out of Carleton University. Tuck et al. Mapped the electromagnetic interference, the static DC component of drones, and this is usually due to a combination of DC currents from the battery, aliased high frequency signals, and other permanent components on the drone. So you can get an idea of this, and this can range in the hundreds of nanotesla region if you're very up close to the drone, and is why we don't put the magnetometers directly on the drones. And then what I typically worked on was looking at the high frequency electromagnetic interference signals. So these are looking at the mechanical rotations of the rotor as these rotors spin. These lead to electromagnetic interference signals that we can pick up in the data here at roughly 50 hertz, as well as, you know, things such as our attitude signals, swinging signals in the magnetometer, and then of course our geologic signals, so mafic dikes. So if you want to read more about kind of these high frequency electromagnetic interference signals, they typically start at the mechanical rotation frequency of the drone and go up into the kilohertz frequency range. And there's probably going to be a lot more publications on this coming in the future as we try and figure out ways to compensate these signals. But a good starter place is the paper I published in Geophysics to look at these specific signals. And then finally, just as a wrap up to drone electromagnetic interference, the two things, again, when we show this diagram that we're looking at that we've quantified now, there are others, but it's the DC electromagnetic interference signal. So this is more of a low frequency or static field. It'll change due to the battery current load and some other phenomenon that do occur, but this is relatively low frequency signals compared to higher frequency signals that are 50 hertz and above. So with that, that's a summary of electromagnetic interference in a nutshell, and I hope that answers some of the questions that were posed in the chat too. But thank you for the time, Ron.
Well, thank you, Callum, for coming in at the last minute, sharing that. Obviously is a very key part of what we have to be considering when we're configuring and doing drone magnetic surveys, configuring the systems. And your work is, I'm very impressed with it. I thank you for taking it on as your PhD thesis. And thank you for giving such actually a very good contribution to this particular webinar. What is the cable length one can drag on a drone? Does anybody on the panel want to answer that one?
And also part of that is there was a question which I think it was related to what Callum said about what is the best distance to suspend a magnetometer. They're sort of related.
Oh, they go hand in hand, and that I think that's what the question is. And it's what is the best distance? I guess Callum answered it mostly in his test of where the signals start to come in, that start to be signals from the drone start to impact the measurement.
I have a problem with too long suspensions, because if you have a low drag bird or no drag bird, if you have a long suspension, the sensor does do whatever it wants to. If you fly slowly, it can actually even fly some loops, which are then problematic in processing. So what you would have to do is to stabilize the bird with a high drag, stabilize the sensor, putting it into a high drag bird. That has the disadvantage that you have to fly at the constant speed to keep the drag up, which in turn causes the drape following ability of the drone to diminish severely, as we know from standard helicopter-borne surveys. So it's a little bit of a catch-22 situation. Yes, you can do you can reduce the platform influences by lengthening the suspension length, but you get other problems that you don't want to have either.
I think Paul might have something
Yeah.
to say as well.
Well, all my only comment is the best data that I've seen came from a survey with a very, very long cable length. So it was 15 meters, and you know the noise envelope was 0.1, was a bit over 0.1 nanotesla. So you know, and that's without compensation or anything. And I guess I guess the other thing you can do is to take the drone up on the cable and just basically do a crazy, you know, crazy little circuit to just basically get the sensor swinging all kinds of ways, and see if you can see, you know, see what happens in the data. You know, that's that.
Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, so I guess that's just you know, I just wonder if we're using way too short cables for a lot of the survey work. You know, those 15-meter cables. You know, even if for most optically pumped mags, you know, they sample even if there is a little bit of swing, it actually doesn't really matter that much. You know, it's you know, we've got the locations on the GPS. We're not trying, you know, it doesn't really matter if you're not, all the readings are on a perfectly straight line. We've got the actual reading locations. That's the main issue. And the actual noise is just really, really low.
Yeah, but Paul, then you have to exclude a couple of type of sensors with a large attitude effect, like the MFAM sensor.
Yes, you do. You do.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah, yeah. I think you would have to, but you know, yeah. So the best data that I've seen wasn't with an MFAM. So.
Let me move on to another question here. It's from Daniel Manzurian. It's what is the best way to compensate for erratic movements of the magnetometer hanging with a cable, both physically or computationally? Which is the best way?
If the compensation would work, and as I pointed out at the moment for suspended sensors, it does not work, then I think the post-mission compensation is the best way of doing it, unless, and we also talked about it, you have a high drag bird, which you don't want to have.
Okay.
Is anyone using multi-cell birds anymore? Just I'm bringing it up because I know with helicopters way back when, like we're talking almost 20 years ago, for helicopters, we used to always have multi-cells. So we had, you know, up to 6, sometimes 3 magnetometers at different angles. So when you got to mountainous areas where you suddenly had changes in speeds and the bird started to move and spin, you automatically went to the bird or the magnetometer that had the strongest signal. And it was a lot more processing, and it was this is where the tech heads get involved and got it all sorted, but the data was really clean. It was really good. And I know that when I was doing it, they had generated a few extras that had been built later that they were using for mountainous work, and they were really effective. And I'm wondering if that technology might translate over to some of the drone stuff, because they seem to have the same issues.
I don't know quite what to say to that. I didn't even know about the helicopter having multi-oriented sensors.
Yeah.
I think that we probably have advanced our sensor technology significantly since then.
Okay.
So,
There's a
sort of leads
question
into
here.
a question about 3 component measurements, tensor measurements. That is there one of the things I've observed is most of the people that are flying 3-axis flux gates are always present their data as a scalar measurement, as a total field measurement. And I think intuitively we could see there could be some real benefit to having the tensor measurement. And I guess one of the questions is do any of the panelists have a comment to make on that? Are we going to see actual tensor mag become a common thing in the future?
Tensor mag is already done with squids. It's not, that's tensor, full tensor gradient mag.
Is it done on a drone?
No.
No. May I say something about this topic?
You may.
Rainer is right. This tensor mag measurements are done by squid magnetometers, but squid magnetometers has a big disadvantage. They are extremely heavy. We speak about more than 30 or 40 kilogram. Second, they are extremely expensive. And as far as I know, squid magnetometers measures a gradient, but to achieve the magnetic field, not the gradient, it's integrated, and integration always means you lose a lot of resolution. So the effect of the very high sensitivity of a squid magnetometer is annihilated by this integration process. I spoke with people who know a lot more about the theory of the mag tensor, and they all told me it would be extremely desirable to have a working system that allows, which is lightweight and not so costly, can be achieved by an institution to measure the gradient, the magnetic gradient from the three components, not from a scalar magnetometer, but the three components. And as far as I know, there is only the flux gate magnetometer left that allows to measure the components. I know from some manufacturers in Germany who develop flux gates for the purpose to find the remaining bombs from the Second World War. They all use a whole bunch of gradiometers made of flux gates to measure the vertical gradient, and they are extremely successful. They use 21 flux gate gradients built on a frame and tow it across the field, and they are extremely successful to detect and locate even very, very small ammunition in the ground, buried in the ground, of course, in the shallow ground. So I think this makes some hope to use flux gates also on drones. In a research project I have conducted in collaboration with the Technical University of Braunschweig, we tried this on a drone, and we are now going to publish it. It was accepted by reviewers a few weeks ago, so it will be published quite soon in Geophysical Journal International. From this research, we know that it's extremely difficult to orient the components, but it's much more easier to orient the gradient rather than a single component. And for example, we were able to define the from our measurements, the gradient measurements, the inclination and declination of the local magnetic field with an accuracy better than one degree. So this gives some hope to develop a gradiometer system based on flux gate sensors in the near future. But the biggest obstacle, I already told this, is the noise of the drone. Because it would be very, very much desirable to have the sensors rigidly attached to the frame of the drone rather than towing it by long lines.
But Johannes, be that as it may, the main problem with the gradient system is that you have to have the positional accuracy of the system down to 0.1 arc seconds to actually calculate the proper gradients. You know, the direction. What is Z and what is X and what is Y? You need to have an extremely accurate positioning or attitude measuring system, and that is a problem.
Yeah.
I'll jump in here.
No,
The short answer to
not
are we going to
for-
see drone tensors or tensor magnetometry is yes. We're working with a client to bring one to market at the moment. Rainer makes a good point about the orthogonality. We've got some ideas on how to solve that. So I think we're really going to see that happening quite soon.
Thank you, Tim. That's a great answer. I hope. How soon will we see this?
Let me know when you want a straight answer on a research project, and I'll do that.
Okay.
There are genuine issues to be solved, but there's huge benefit in the tensor space. We're getting sort of everything that matters about the magnetic field, some of which we gloss over with total field and even with vector. So we're pretty excited about it. There are challenges, but I think the miniaturization, the lightweight nature of the system is obviously key. It lends itself well to a drone payload. The spirit of sharing in this forum I fully appreciate, but obviously this is a commercial project. So what I will offer is it's on its way.
Cool. Good to hear it. I'm glad to hear about these developments. Unfortunately, in a way, we're all kind of in business and we got to protect our IP, but these are things that are important to bring to the community to say, hey, the future is looking pretty doggone good in many ways it's looking good. So so
many people are innovating and looking to solve similar problems. You know, I've been gratified working as part of this committee, how other folk are solving problems that I'm wrestling with, or hopefully I'm solving some they're wrestling with. So these kind of shared fora are really useful. And you know, these are problems we're going to solve collaboratively.
I agree. I agree.
If we change the processing direction, that would help full tensor gradient measurements quite a lot, like Austin Bridgeport. They run an FDG survey, and their processor Gary Barnes has a very advanced equivalent layer processing, which gives absolute superior results compared to standard processing for full tensor data. Maybe Tim, you're in his part of the world. Maybe you could talk to him.
Yeah, it's possible. Gary's a busy guy, and yeah, they've done some good things with that. This is an airborne gravity gradiometry system, so not quite in today's space. But you know, some of these numeric processing, particularly we get into the tensor domain, are self-similar. So yeah, there's several people looking at this. I'm confident we'll sort it out, but it's not easy, and it may not be imminent. In fact, I don't think it is imminent. We're pointing our noses in that direction.
Yeah, but it's good to hear that they're working on it. It really is needed at some point. Hopefully we'll be able to use that data. I'm going to move on here, and I got two questions from Jared Anderson. The first one is, can drone mag be used for nearshore exploration? If so, how can we control the water depth? And then flight height is important over land. How might this concept apply over water? And then the second question, I'm going to kind of combine it into the essentially one package of questions. During data acquisition with BV loss missions, how can we monitor data quality and sources of noise? Does anybody on the platform, on the panel want to answer either one or parts of those questions? Go ahead.
Thanks. I'll jump in on one. The nearshore, of course, is important. Again, we're working with a client. Their application is UXO, and the difficulty in that environment, you can't get insurance for a piloted rig, which may be the nature of Jared's question. Yeah, we need to know about. Well, we don't need to know about water depth per se, because water is non-magnetic. It does affect the source depth. It does mean we can't get as close to the source. So, Jared, I don't know what your application is, but if it's shallow ordnance or shallow infrastructure, the water is a barrier, but it's also not a barrier we can do a lot about. So water depth per se, not an issue, except in terms of detectability.
Except for the swell.
Yeah.
Ah,
the swell.
no, we can talk about the swell.
Swell
Yeah, do you want to
condition.
do that, Ryan?
No, better not is horrible because you can't remove it.
That's pretty
It's just-
subtle stuff, but maybe we need
just-
to. Yeah.
No,
If they're
but
finding
that-
UXO,
that-
probably not. If they're finding subtle magnetic fascies in the geological substrata, then yeah,
It
ocean
can go
swell.
up to 2 nanotesla.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, it's at 50-meter ground clearance. So and it's data. It's actually signal. It's not noise, but it is noise, obviously, for the interpretation. So that is a problem. And Swiss guys are actually employing a submarine drone to look for UXOs.
Can you explain? I live in Colorado. I don't live near the ocean. I have no idea what you mean by swell. So could you explain swell to me?
It's just wave action.
It's wave action.
The long wavelength wave action, not the breakers you see at your shoreline, but the slow movement of the water surface up and down. Specifically, fresh water isn't a problem, but salt water is.
Huh.
And if you look at that, those images as well, it produces a little. There's a camera, a little eddy current. All right, and that produces a magnetic field.
Okay. So it's really one might think of it as an EM effect.
It
Yes.
is. It's conductive water. Conductive water moving in a static earth field induces little currents.
Cool. Good to know. Does anybody want to address the data quality and sources of noise issue on BV loss missions? Paul, do you have a few comments on that?
Oh, sorry, what the question again?
During data acquisition with BV loss missions, how can we monitor data quality and sources of noise?
Not until the drone gets home and you download the data.
Okay. All right. So we really can at this point, is what you're saying.
Not in real time, but yeah, basically.
No, but beyond visual line of sight is just a legal term. It doesn't have anything to do with geophysics.
No, but what he's really saying is long time missions. When the drone is away from you and you're collecting it, when you fly BV loss, you're really trying to fly much further. Therefore, you must have drones that are capable of flying for at least an hour, maybe 2 hours at a time. And you're collecting data during that time. Can you do anything about monitoring the data quality during those collections?
As Paul said, only after you downloaded the data, not in real time.
After, okay. The next question is, there's a big effort to reduce methane emissions and funding available to locate P&A oil and gas wells. Given the extremely large number of abandoned oil and gas wells in the US, is doing drone magnetics to locate the wells a practical approach to solve this huge challenge? I guess I'm the only one that actually does that, so I'll answer that question. Yes, the answer, Mike, this is from Mike Allison. I actually know Mike. So yeah, yes, in fact, in the US right now, there are several initiatives, organized by various states, funded by the US government to survey areas that have legacy oil and gas wells. And magnetics is a really good tool for cost effectively locating these old infrastructures, bits of oil and gas infrastructure. We'll move on to the next one. And if anybody wants to get more information on that, all you have to do is email me, and I'll be happy to drone on about what I've been doing with it. So, what is the best way to compensate for erratic measurements of magnetography? We've addressed that one. Let's see.
There's one here, Ron, on the topic of sensors. What's your take on rubidium sensors?
Okay. Yeah, anybody on the panel want to address that one?
Paul is gone. That's his sphere.
Oh, that Paul is a rubidium sensor guy.
Yeah,
Caleb?
the data he showed from the second vertical derivative, that was just basically corrected data. They were extremely good. If they were flown with a rubidium mag, that is amazing.
Cool.
I
Caleb?
think, yeah, I can add something just quick from the technical side. I think the rubidium and potassium sensors typically have less heading error as one major benefit to them compared to the cesium magnetometers. So that can make them a lot more, yeah, viable for getting rid of attitude variations throughout flight or something you have to worry about less. So little thought there.
Very good. Very good. I've never had the opportunity to actually use a rubidium, so I don't know much about it. Let's see. Will flight speed do? What flight speed do you recommend for recording magnetic data?
1,000 hertz sampling rate. It doesn't matter at all.
Well, if it's not 1,000 hertz sampling rate, not every magnetometer samples at 1,000 hertz.
There's a clear, it depends on the ground clearance. There's a clear relation between ground clearance and line spacing. So basically for total field, you measure or you sample the magnetic field changes correctly if you fly a line spacing that is double the ground clearance. So if you, let's say, if you have 10-meter ground clearance, you can fly 20-meter line space. So at that height already, the speed doesn't really matter if you have 10 hertz sampling. You fly at 10 meters per second, so it's 1 meter per second. So it doesn't really matter. Obviously, for UXO data, that is a different story. So you want to fly slow because you want to measure even the tiniest wobble in the mag field.
Yeah, the question is less to do with productivity because, as Rainer said, we're massively oversampling. It's more to do with how much you're throwing the magnetic sensor around. I worked with a client a few years ago that they had a mag beneath a helicopter, and I nearly had heart failure because they were flying the helicopter and then stopping it abruptly at the end of the line, and the payload was swinging all over the place. And they weren't doing anything wrong in their mind. They just didn't know that they were killing the data. So flight speed is more to do with, slow and level and all the rest. There is a commercial component, we want to fly slow so we get as much signal, but at the sampling rates we're talking about now, that's almost insignificant. And by far the bigger issue is line spacing.
Johannes, do you have a comment on that?
No, not yet. No.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'll comment just from a practical point of view is that the speed of the aircraft is often related to the amount of wind that the sensor has to pass through. In many cases, you elect to fly it as fast as you can, but if the weather conditions are somewhat adverse, meaning more windy, you tend to find that there's a sweet spot that you tend to find. And I'm speaking specifically of a rotor aircraft, a multicopter with a suspended payload. I suspect that it's probably different when you have a fixed wing aircraft, and that you could generally fly it faster. You have to, because it has to have at least a certain level of speed to maintain its loftiness, if you will. So I think from experience, from my experience, it really it depends on the conditions that you're having to operate in, both in terms of altitude and in terms of weather and in terms of the characteristics of your aircraft. So I hope that is a typical geophysical answer, by the way. It would be kind of translated into "it depends." If I had to put it into 2 words, it depends. Depends on what you're trying to achieve. So Jeff, are there any other questions that I missed here that we need to address?
There was one that Johannes brought up, and about what type of magnetometer, what type of suspension is superior to achieve highest resolution. Is there a reference survey that demonstrates high resolution in a given survey, and what magnetometer has been used? So have I paraphrased that correctly, Johannes?
Yeah.
You may want to speak to that.
Yeah. I think it's self-evident to use a long line and suspend it below the sensor below a multicopter, because this is the easiest solution you can use to be successful to acquire useful data on a drone survey. But especially in the early days of my company, we were involved in near surface problems, in particular UXO detection, and there you cannot use a long line and suspend your sensor below the multicopter for several issues. Even if you are able to track the position of your sensor with a very high precision GPS receiver, the client always wants to see measurements on a very regular grid, and he doesn't like deviations of half a meter or so. This is, I think, understandable, because if you are required to to detect and locate very small objects, there's a dire need to not only to locate to know the position of the sensor with high accuracy, and high means better than half a meter or 10 centimeters, but also to fly the sensor on very, very straight lines. And this avoids, I think this is an argument against the suspension of the sensor on a line below the helicopter. This is the reason why from the very beginning we spent a lot of effort to invent a suspension on a rigid pole and damping elements that allow to reduce motion of the sensor even if there is crosswinds. I think we were very successful with this kind of suspension. Also, there are some obstacles. First, you have, if you use a rigid connection between the sensor and the multicopter, you obviously have problems during takeoff and landing. So your sensor has to be has to be bended by a joint. And second, especially to land such a construction is quite difficult. Usually, drone pilots land in the stabilized mode. But this can lead easily to a crash when the sensor touches ground, because the drone doesn't know there's a payload on a rigid connection below it, and thinks there's already the ground because there is some force. If you are not an experienced pilot, this can easily lead to a crash. So the drone in most cases has to be landed manually, which is not so easy if you are not very experienced. Landing manually is difficult compared to the GPS supported mode.
Yeah.
Cool. We have one, what I'm seeing is one last question. I won't address the regulatory requirements, Richard, because Jeff is responding to that, and I don't think it's as critical as the last question. And the last question is, for a fixed area, what is the ratio of cost between drone and helicopter survey? Nobody's answering that question.
That's probably your field of experience.
How long is a piece of string?
Well, I think I would answer it as it depends. Drones have the ability to actually fly closer and much tighter spaces, much more economically than a helicopter survey would. If I find that if I'm looking at an area where it's more than a few square miles, depending on what the density of data and which is related to the objective that you're trying to achieve. If it's a very tight flight line spacing, generally a helicopter and let's say it's a 2 square mile area, generally a helicopter can accomplish it much quicker, but there's a huge amount of cost associated with the helicopter. And in some cases, the drone might be more expensive, but can actually, I mean, it might be close to the same cost as a helicopter, but it might be preferable because you can fly it closer to the ground. If it's a much bigger area of interest, survey area, helicopters can be very advantageous in both in speed of data collection, and it really that's the key. And the aerial coverage you can get with a drone legally. We currently, at least in the US, cannot fly beyond visual line of sight without a waiver. What that really means is that we can fly beyond visual line of sight, but the process of getting to that permit to do so is often a very onerous and very time-consuming process with the FAA. And so generally on surveys that it's a difference between a helicopter and a drone, if it's big enough area, the helicopter is preferred. If it's there's a sweet spot where drones really do make a lot more sense. If it's a small area, obviously drones just make a lot more financial sense to use that. So there, I've given my answer. I've droned on about that way too long.
Plus, you have to think about the HSE cost for a helicopter. That was the reason that the exploration company launched that Prion project, because they were basically annoyed by the HSE procedures that cost them a hell of a lot of money.
Right. So I would say that is actually the good news for drones. Is more use of drones in the future is that we do have a cost benefit that whether it's exploration or whether it's working in areas that are difficult to access, there's a huge number of benefits. Now, what I think will happen, this is my opinion, is that we will, once we've achieved the ability to fly beyond visual line of sight, and that is meaning that you have approved technologies by the controllers of the airspace. In my case, it's the FAA. When those technologies are approved, we will have beyond visual line of sight, and we will loosen up the restriction on the size of the drones that we can actually fly. So what is coming is larger aircraft, probably helicopters actually, and probably certain forms of multi-copters that will be tasked to do drone magnetics, and then of course other types of drone geophysical surveys. So I'm going to try to, Jeff, I'm going to try to do a wrap up here. I've got it, it's 8 o'clock here in Denver. And we've had I want to thank all of our panelists for contributing to this, what I think is a very robust discussion, and all of our presenters for contributing to this first launch of the guidelines from drone geophysics, both in terms of what you've done in terms of helping write the guidelines, but also trying to tackle the problem of addressing the what is, I think, a very important thing to do, that is to have the community of people that are using drones provide information on what the best practices are. I think we all have a very strong interest in actually having the best quality data possible for the mission at hand, for the objective we're trying to achieve. And hopefully, as an audience, you've all taken away something from this.
People have had to rush through their presentations, but people can do them at their leisure, and think about each slide as it's presented, and take it in a lot more closely.
I want to thank everybody for attending this thing today. This turned out to be far better than what we were originally anticipating. Anyway, I'm just amazed at how well it came off. And I want to thank again all of the presenters and the panelists. I think you guys did an excellent job. I think in total, hopefully we've started something. I'm going to make one point here at the end, 2 points, is that one of the questions was, is there a chat room where we can go and ask questions about this? And I hadn't considered that before, but I'll be evaluating whether or not we can actually do that through the website that we're setting up. And secondly is that I want to remind everybody that this isn't just about drone magnetics, is that we really have a bigger mission of being able to help people do a better job with all sorts of drone geophysical data collection, processing, interpretation, and things like that. That's really what our overall long-term mission is. And so this is the starting point of what I think will be a heck of a lot of work in the long term. So anyway, thank you all. Thank you all for listening to me at this point. And Jeff, do you have a few more things to say at the end?
Yeah, just to reiterate, it would be great for people with the requisite expertise to come and join the committee to help out some of the upcoming guidelines. And as I say, please put your comments in. We hope to release a second version in April, and we'll have some more news about that. And finally, please help support the website financially if you can see your way clear to do that. And please get in touch with Ron about that. So, yeah.
Thank you, Jeff. All of the panelists, again, I want to wish you a great day or evening or night or morning. In my case, I'm just starting my day. I've actually got to go to the field and do a drone survey today. So we've got good weather, and everybody that flies drones knows when the weather's good, you get out and fly. So it's time to fly.